Hi, my name's Thete, a very experienced Retribution Paladin who's been producing the go-to Retribution Paladin guides on YouTube for the last few years, now perfected in my Fighting Uruk-hai, the Battle for Azeroth Essentials guide. In this detailed guide you can expect to do much more than simply be told which buttons to press like a common monkey. Instead, you will learn how to understand the spec and be able to make the right decisions no matter what the game throws at you. I will be covering the strengths and weaknesses of the spec, how to DPS as a Ret Paladin, utility, talent, stats, and other resources to help you go from beginner to intermediate to expert with these shiny paragons of virtue. This guide is aimed primarily at PvE content in Battle for Azeroth. To view individual sections, please use the timestamps in the description below. Do please note that this guide covers the core elements of the spec. More transient information such as the use of equipment including trinkets and Azerite pieces will be covered in standalone companion guides at the appropriate time. You can always find the most up-to-date guides in the playlist linked in the description below. As guides become out of date, including this one, they will be replaced in the playlist by an updated version. When it comes to strengths and weaknesses, Retribution Paladins are likely to be reasonably effective in Mythic Plus dungeons, with Blessing of Protection, Lay on Hands, Blessing of Freedom and Word of Glory all adding some effective defensive utility when things get tough. Pushing extremely high keys, however, is likely to see other specs preferred if truth be told. For Mythic Raiding, however, these same abilities are much less likely to be useful. Most fatal damage in a Mythic Raid is not physical, and so Blessing of Protection is usually only useful on 2 or 3 fights in an expansion. In addition, good healing teams generally don't need an extra help from DPS off healing, even during difficult moments. In terms of our DPS strengths, those can change significantly over the course of an expansion, depending on the balancing that Blizzard undertake on a regular basis. However, we can expect to be pretty handy when it comes to bursting important adds down as usual, and strong on bosses where there isn't a lot of movement away from targets required. Having a traditionally low amount of downtime relative to some specs means that we suffer more than most if we can't attack something all the time. However, in Battle for Azeroth, Blizzard have increased the amount of downtime in all specs, so this may be less of a problem for Ret Paladins as it has been in previous expansions. Retribution Paladin DPS at its simplest takes the form of building holy power through abilities, including Blade of Justice, Judgment and Crusader Strike, and then spending it through finishers such as Templar's Verdict and Divine Storm. Added to that, Judgment applies a debuff to our target which empowers the next spender we use against that target. Talents increase the range of holy power builders, spenders, buffs and debuffs that we have at our disposal, but I will cover those later in this guide. Our damage is a mix of physical and holy damage. Please note that when inspecting tooltips, enemy targets have armor which reduces the effective damage from physical attacks such as Blade of Justice, Crusader Strike and our melee auto attacks. However, the holy damage of our other abilities is accurately reflected in the tooltip because our targets will not be automatically reducing that damage. Our mastery increases the damage of our holy damage abilities, the value of which is already added on to the values shown on tooltips. This means that having lots of mastery will mean more emphasis on the use of holy damage abilities. This can have an effect on which talents you select. Judgment is a ranged holy damage ability which generates 1 holy power and places a debuff on the target, increasing the damage of our next spender. Because of this, it is a very powerful ability and should be used as often as possible. Unlike in Legion, the debuff only applies to the primary target and is consumed when a spender is used on that target. It is not worth worrying excessively about which spender to use it on when there is a choice. Just follow the standard action priority list detailed later in this video and you will do fine. In a situation where you are fighting multiple mobs, try not to use Judgment on a mob that is almost dead. If the Judgment spell kills the mob, then you waste the debuff. In this situation, it is better to use the Judgment on another mob and then finish off the original target with another ability. The debuff lasts quite a long time, so you should have no problem getting the benefit from it in this way. Blade of Justice is a mid-range physical damage dealing ability which generates 2 holy power. Having a 12-yard range means that it can be used as you are running towards a target. Our passive ability, Art of War, means that there is a chance that the Blade of Justice ability will suddenly reset its cooldown, so you should be aware of that in order to maximise its benefit. Crusader Strike is our lowest priority holy power builder. As with Blade of Justice, the damage is physical, but Crusader Strike is melee range only and does not produce much damage, except when buffed by other abilities. In most circumstances, holy power builders are your highest priority, unless using them would waste holy power. In other words, you should not use Blade of Justice if you have 4 or 5 holy power, and should not use Judgment or Crusader Strike if you have 5 holy power. Our baseline holy power spenders include Templar's Verdict for single target use and Divine Storm for AoE use. Do note that we need at least 3 mobs before Divine Storm becomes useful in most situations. These spenders should normally be used when either no Holy Power builders are available, or if using them would overcap Holy Power. It's important to note that although our Holy Power spenders do a lot of damage, we always want to prioritise the Holy Power builders so that we don't run into a load of dead time later on. It does more damage over the course of a fight doing this. Avenging Wrath is our DPS cooldown. It may be used every 2 minutes and will provide a large boost to our DPS. It is important that you maximise your effectiveness during the period of time that Avenging Wrath is active. Do what you can to ensure that you will not have to move away from valid targets to deal with mechanics, as this will be ruinous to your overall DPS. If a mechanic is about to go out which might cause you to move, then delay using your Avenging Wrath. Generally, we want to use Avenging Wrath as often as possible, as long as we can maximise our DPS during its duration. However, there are times when it gives up more use than others. The general rule of thumb is that you should delay using Avenging Wrath for when you can get the maximum benefit, but you do not want to lose an entire use of it during a fight. For example, if a fight lasts 4.5 minutes, then you essentially need to use Avenging Wrath as soon as it's available. However, if the fight lasts 5 minutes, then you have about 40 seconds to play with during the fight to delay it to a slightly better opportunity. More serious players will use past logs to try and work out the best times to use their DPS cooldowns for maximum effect. One of the most important utility abilities from melee DPS is the interrupt. Ours is called Rebuke and works on a 15-second cooldown. As with other melee interrupts, it is off the global cooldown. That means that we can use it very reactively for instant effect. We do not have to stop dealing damage while we use it. It is also melee range only, so we have to be in direct contact with our intended target before using it. Because interrupts are an important job for melee, it is worth making sure that you can see the target cast bar easily. Retribution Paladins have very limited movement abilities. If we are slowed or rooted or believe that we might be in the next few seconds, we can use Blessing of Freedom to allow us to move at normal speed. The blessing has a 25-second cooldown and 8-second duration, meaning that it can be used liberally in any situation in which it might be useful. It can also be placed on other players, and there are typically 2 or 3 raid encounters during an expansion where this may be useful. If we need to just get away in a hurry, we have a 100% speed boost for 3 seconds in the form of Divine Steed. It is possible to gain a second charge via talents. This ability currently has a 45-second recharge time. As such, we cannot use this too liberally. For example, if you have to move out during a mechanic and then use your Divine Steed to move back into DPS range more quickly, you put yourself in a difficult position if another mechanic requires you to move out more quickly than is possible with normal movement speed. A movement speed should generally be prioritised for defensive use rather than offensive. However, if you will not need the ability to save yourself during the fight, then absolutely use it to reduce the time you are away from DPS targets. We also have the ability to slow enemy mobs and players in the form of Hand of Hindrance. This may be useful when kiting a mob that might otherwise kill you, or simply to prevent a mob reaching a part of the encounter to give you more time to kill it. Hammer of Justice is our baseline stun. It is a single target stun with a 1-minute cooldown which lasts for 6 seconds. In solo content or dungeons, it may be useful in providing respite against a particularly damaging mob for a few seconds. If you get yourself into a dangerous situation, it can also be used to give you more time to run away. Did I say run away? I meant tactically withdraw. In a raid, there are usually a number of encounters which may have adds where it is useful to stun them. For example, adds that fixate on other players. Be careful, however, as sometimes stunning a fixating mob causes them to fixate on someone else when the stun ends, surprising everyone. Retribution Paladin defensives are a bit of a mixed bag. We are extremely resilient in solo content, but our defensives are much less used in high-end raid content. Divine Shield is our most powerful defensive and is often referred to as Bubble. On the face of it, Divine Shield is an extremely powerful defensive ability. It immunes us from all damage. It should be remembered that there is a cap on the amount of damage it will protect us from. Some things are just supposed to kill us, but the cap is several times our maximum health, so will work against most sources of damage. The major downside to Divine Shield for raid encounters in particular is that the 5-minute cooldown means that you can probably only use it once per encounter. You can't use it in dangerous situations just in case, but it would be more than a little embarrassing if you died but could have used your Divine Shield. It is often suitable for solo soaking some mechanics, though again, the cooldown prevents its use as part of a rotation, so other classes tend to be called upon for this task more often. It should generally be used when you feel that there's a good chance that you will die. For example, when your health is low and you know you are about to take some damage from an area effect. If in doubt, it is better to use it when you didn't need it than die when you could have saved yourself. You'll just have to be extra careful once used. Blessing of Protection is a defensive that makes you immune to physical damage and is also on a 5-minute cooldown. The benefit of Blessing of Protection over Divine Shield is that it may be used on a nearby friendly player. On the face of it, this sounds very useful. However, there are almost no encounters in over 13 years of World of Warcraft raiding that have fatal physical mechanics. Almost all such mechanics are magical, and so Blessing of Protection only sees action in a raid once or twice in expansion typically. However, it is very useful in solo content, especially for tackling elite mobs, and may also see regular use in dungeons. Just be careful not to use it on a tank unless they have specifically asked for it, otherwise they may lose aggro and the boss or mobs will pummel someone else. Using Blessing of Protection on a tank when a gnome is next on threat is often hilarious, but may not be worth the trouble it will cause you in the aftermath. Lay on Hands is a massive heal on a very long cooldown of 10 minutes. It will heal yourself or another friendly target for your maximum health. It is instant cast and currently off the global cooldown. That means we can use it very reactively if either ourselves or someone else suddenly drops to next to no health and you don't want to take a chance that the healers or victim themselves has it under control. Now these three powerful defensives of Divine Shield, Blessing of Protection and Lay on Hands also debuffs the recipient with Forbearance. This debuff lasts for 30 seconds and prevents them benefiting from one of the other abilities while the debuff remains. For example, if you use Lay on Hands on yourself because your health dropped very low, you will not be able to use Divine Shield for 30 seconds. As such, it's very important to consider how to use these abilities. It is especially important to consider carefully the use of the abilities on another Paladin player. For example, during Late Legion, I was planning on using Divine Shield on myself to run through some fatal ground effects safely, but another Paladin used Lay on Hands on me just before this, and so I died due to Forbearance preventing me activating Divine Shield. Shield of Vengeance is technically a defensive ability, as it places an Absorb Shield on you which lasts for 15 seconds. However, it also deals damage when the buff ends, and so is often used for the purpose of dealing damage rather than an actual defensive. If the Absorb Shield is fully consumed within the 15-second duration, then it will end and deal damage equal to the full value of the Absorb to nearby enemies. If the Absorb Shield lasts the full 15 seconds, then it will deal damage to nearby enemies equal to the amount it absorbed. Because of this, players tend to try and use it as often as possible, frequently deliberately standing in damage and AoE in order to consume the Absorb. However, as with all such things, remember that it should be used as a defensive first. If a fight doesn't present enough danger to your health to warrant needing Shield of Vengeance as a defensive, as many won't, then absolutely use it aggressively rather than let it go to waste. Do note that the damage it does is split between nearby enemies. It is therefore more valuable when it can be used on a boss that isn't in range of low priority adds. Cleanse Toxins allows us to remove poisons and diseases from a friendly target within range. This is of more use in dungeons and solo content where you may be the only one who can do this. In raids it is likely that the healing team will have it covered, but it may still be useful even here. Greater Blessing of Kings is a buff which creates a small Absorb Shield on the recipient every 6 seconds. It lasts for an hour and persists through death, so there should be no need to reapply it during an encounter or even an entire dungeon. However, it will disappear if either the casting Paladin changes specialisation or the recipient changes talents or specialisation. It may be placed on a friendly player in range. This is not considered a strong buff, and so you are unlikely to have people bothering you for it. If nobody seems desperate for it, either place it on a tank or yourself. If a non-tank has the job of taking some extra damage by either DPS tanking or soaking damage puddles, then it may be useful to give them the buff. Greater Blessing of Wisdom allows the recipient to regenerate health and mana periodically. As with Greater Blessing of Kings, it may be placed on a friendly target or yourself. This buff is especially useful for healers and so should generally be given to one. Arcane mages are also quite partial to the buff. The mana return is far more valuable than the health regeneration. Do not give this to a tank, no matter how much they complain. I even wrote a little poem. Greater Blessing of Wisdom is not for a tank, no matter how much they will whine. It's for healers or mages and not for the tanks, or you'll be throwing pills before swine. Flash of Light is our baseline heal, which costs a lot of mana and provides moderate healing at best, but it may be useful in an emergency, especially when your defensives are all on cooldown. Now, as with all classes that have a healing spec, we have a resurrection ability. Redemption may only be used out of combat and is generally used when we are the first back from a corpse run and can resurrect the healer so that they can resurrect everyone else. Of course, in that situation, we could just switch to Holy Spec, resurrect everyone, and then switch back to Retribution. So Redemption is mostly just useful in Mythic Plus dungeons where you can't change spec. In situations where it may be required, We also have a taunt in the form of Hand of Reckoning. This might be used to save a situation where the tank is in real trouble or has died. It is possible to use Divine Shield and then taunt. Don't do it the other way around. The first thing to note about talents in the battle for Azeroth is that Ret Paladins are likely to have much more variation than in previous expansions. Traditionally, there has been best talents and talent combinations for given situations, and so individual players often didn't have to think about their own character. However, in Battle for Azeroth, different talents not only shine in different situations, but their relative strength also varies based on your own stats, Azerite armor traits, and even the tactics used by your group in dungeons and especially raids. You will not simply want to ape what everyone else seems to be doing, as it may not be best for you or your situation. But not to worry, not only will we go through each talent here, I produce Ret Paladin videos most weeks which will answer all questions thrown my way. For advanced guides on specialist retribution topics, keep checking the Ret Paladin guide playlist on the channel for updates. Finally, before looking at the individual talents, please bear in mind that all the talents on the left-hand side of each row are the simplest to use. They are all passive and would make a good choice for new players while you get to grips with other aspects of the toolkit at your disposal. You will not be losing significant amounts of damage over what would be the theoretically best combination of talents either. Win-win. Zeal is the passive option within this row. Whenever you use Judgment, which is also a high priority ability, your next 3 auto attacks occur 30% more quickly. They will also deal a small amount of holy damage, which is boosted by our mastery. This is the go-to talent if ever there's going to be a significant amount of AoE, for example in dungeons. Righteous Verdict probably requires a bit of tracking to get the best out of it. Every time you use Templar's Verdict, you will get a buff, which means that your next Templar's Verdict will deal extra damage if used before the buff runs out. The buff currently lasts for 6 seconds, so you can't afford too much of a delay. The idea will be to keep this buff rolling for as long as possible. It will be easier to do this with higher haste values, during heroism for example, or if you manage to acquire a lot of haste on your equipment. Tracking the buff will let you know when it's about to run out. If it has a second left before expiring and you can use the Templar's Verdict, then you should probably do so regardless of the priority. Although this row is entirely single target focused, this talent is the only one that is of no value in AoE situations. You should therefore probably not consider taking it unless almost all of the important damage is single target. This talent is also punished quite severely on encounters where you have to frequently be out of melee range, even if it's only for short periods. A stand still and whack the boss for a few minutes is the ideal situation for this talent. Finally, Execution Sentence is a holy power spender which deals holy damage, similar to Templar's Verdict, as well as costing 3 holy power. But it also places a debuff on the target for 12 seconds, which causes all of your holy damage dealing abilities to inflict more damage on that target. Ideally, you'll want to use as many holy damage dealing abilities during that window as possible. However, it is of prime importance that Execution Sentence be used on cooldown to make sure that it lines up with Avenging Wrath. This is more important than waiting for optimal conditions for using the debuff. The cooldown of 30 seconds is not reduced by haste, so it should be a case of every 4th one lining up with Avenging Wrath. Do note, this talent looks complicated to use, but it really isn't. Just use it on cooldown. Fires of Justice reduces the recharge time of your Crusader Strike and also has a chance to proc a buff that will cause your next Holy Power spender to require 1 Holy Power fewer. This talent is mostly used by people who wish to reduce the downtime in their rotation, especially at lower haste levels. However, it does not necessarily produce the best damage output even with low haste. You need to sim it for yourself. Blade of Wrath doubles the proc rate of Art of War. It also increases the damage of the Blade of Justice by 25%. This talent will not only increase the proportion of your damage that comes from physical damage and may be very suitable for gear with low mastery, but will also significantly reduce your downtime. This is a very strong talent in all situations, but it is important to note that you are tracking your Blade of Justice to get the best out of it. It is no use resetting your cooldown if you didn't even notice. Hammer of Wrath gives us a new ability with a 30-yard range which deals a reasonable amount of holy damage and generates 1 holy power. Hammer of Wrath may only be used when you have Avenging Wrath active or when your target has less than 20% of its health left. The situations which will particularly suit Hammer of Wrath will be boss fights where the execute phase is either abnormally long or where there is a crucial and very tight DPS check at the end of the fight. This is quite common on very tough raid bosses. In Mythic Plus dungeons, you may find it useful on trash if you keep an eye on health. If you see a mob low on health that is not your primary target, switch to it so that Hammer of Wrath becomes active. If you always try and have a sub 20% health mob as your target, you will get the best out of this talent in AoE situations. Fist of Justice is a way of reducing the cooldown of your Hammer of Justice stun. Every time you spend Holy Power, the cooldown of Hammer of Justice is reduced by 2 seconds per Holy Power spent. This is the default talent to take in this row for most types of content. Repentance is a long duration single target incapacitant. It's similar to a stun, however it is broken by damage. It's not instant cast, so cannot be used while moving, but the cast time is very short and reduced by haste. However, it only works against certain types of mobs and so isn't always useful. Because it only works against certain types of mobs and because it is broken by damage, you should only take this talent if you know there's likely to be a need for crowd control to a susceptible mob for up to a minute and that it will not be immediately broken. Blinding Light is an AoE disorientate which is broken by damage but does not break if that damage is holy. That means that you can use it on a group of mobs and still use abilities such as Divine Storm and Consecration. It can be useful when soloing and you accidentally pull too many mobs. It can allow you a few seconds respite to get some control back, or simply to give you a head start should you decide to run away. Did I say run away again? You know what I mean. Divine Judgment causes your next judgment to be buffed for every target hit by a Holy Power spender. It stacks up to a specified maximum for each target hit as well. Now, at the moment, as I write this guide, this particular talent is generally not competitive. It is likely that Blizzard are going to change it at some point, so I don't want to talk about it too much here, but if and when they do change it, I will do a separate video dedicated to it and place it in the playlist alongside this video. Consecration has been much improved since Legion. It now generates 1 Holy Power, which doesn't need any targets to be hit before it will do this. In addition, the duration of the damage is condensed into 6 seconds, meaning that you shouldn't need to waste damage as mobs die or are dragged out of the effect. The cooldown for the ability is 20 seconds and this is fixed. It is not reduced by haste. Because Consecration seems the most overt AoE ability in what is meant to be an AoE talent row, people assume that it is a poor choice for single target. This is not necessarily the case and may well be the best option for you. You should always sim the talents to be sure. Details on how to do that later. Wake of Ashes deals a high amount of instant damage in a cone 12 yards in front of you. It also generates Holy Power, and this is no longer dependent on hitting targets. It will just generate the Holy Power without any targets being hit at all. It also slows targets for 5 seconds, and stuns undead and demon mobs for 5 seconds also. The cooldown is not affected by haste. Because the damage of Wake of Ashes is in a frontal cone, you should make some effort to be facing as many targets as possible when you use it. Due to generating 5 Holy Power, you may overcap slightly. There is no great problem with using Wake of Ashes if you have, say, 1 Holy Power, but try and spend before using if you have more. If you have 2 Holy Power, for example, it might be possible to use a Crusader Strike, spend, then use Wake of Ashes without causing too much delay. Unbreakable Spirit reduces the cooldown on Divine Shield, Lay on Hands, and Shield of Vengeance by 30%. This means that your Divine Shield will now have a cooldown of 3.5 minutes and may be used more often in difficult content. Choosing this talent is likely to be based around how often you feel yourself to need a defensive. The reduction to Lay on Hands will still not allow any extra uses on most raid fights, but may be of slightly more use in high Mythic Plus dungeons. Cavalier simply grants you an extra charge of Divine Steed. This is a useful talent when higher than normal movement demands are likely to be made of you, either in raid fights or Mythic Plus dungeons where there may be large gaps between trash packs, or there is a frequent boss mechanic that demands you move quickly. If you are not likely to need a speed boost very often, you might do better to consider one of the defensive options in this row. Eye for an Eye provides a flat damage reduction on a reasonable cooldown of 1 minute, but only works for physical damage. As already mentioned, physical damage is not common in raids and rarely dangerous when it is. However, for the few fights where this is the case, then Eye for an Eye is likely to be a very useful extra defensive. In Mythic Plus dungeons, physical damage is more common and you may well get use out of this ability, especially on a skittish week where you're going to be pulling aggro regularly. In addition, whilst active, anybody attacking you in melee combat will take physical damage themselves every time they hit you. This is of less use for group PvE, but may be amusing in solo content or PvP. Selfless Healer generates a buff that causes your next flash of light to heal for 10% more and cast 25% more quickly when you use Holy Power spenders. The buff stacks up to 4 times, so if you stack 4 times before using a flash of light, then it will be instant cast and may be used whilst moving. This can be convenient in all forms of content, but is particularly suitable in solo content for quickly healing yourself after killing mobs while you move towards the next ones. Justicar's Vengeance is an ability which costs 5 Holy Power and deals a relatively small amount of damage for its cost. However, it also heals you for the damage it deals. Against a stunned mob, it will do 50% extra damage, and therefore healing. This can sometimes be useful in solo situations where you are likely to be fighting mobs which can be stunned and so benefit from the extra damage. The problem is that some people view this as a suitable talent for use for damage purposes, with either Divine Purpose procs or to help build up Crusade stacks more quickly. It is a DPS loss to use it as a damage dealing ability in almost all situations. To be on the safe side, never think of this ability as anything other than a costly self-heal. Although it is sometimes capable of doing more damage than a Templar's Verdict, it is not worth the holy power cost. The only time it is worthwhile for damage is potentially, and I only say potentially, with a Divine Purpose proc on a stunned mob. In any other situation, it is a loss of damage to use it. Word of Glory is much improved compared to the Legion version. It has an expanded range of 40 yards and can be used on any friendly target within that range. It is no longer purely a self-cast. It will heal the target plus 2 other friendly targets around it for a substantial amount. It costs 3 holy power and so represents a significant loss of DPS to use. However, it can be a lifesaver in Mythic Plus dungeons in particular. It might even see some effective use in raids as well. In addition to the holy power cost, it also has a 1 minute recharge time, though it does have 2 charges. This means that you cannot just spam the ability. However, the recharge time is short enough that you can afford to use it whenever you find yourself or your group in a tight spot where extra healing might help. Remember that saving a life is worth more than the DPS lost to you. Divine Purpose gives you a chance to cast your next Holy Power spender for free, and that spender will also deal more damage. A lot of Ret Paladin players enjoy the proc-based gameplay that this talent provides, but it also adds a level of randomness which some other players do not appreciate. It may not be ideal in a situation where you have to reliably make a tight DPS check in a short window of time. Crusade replaces your Avenging Wrath and has the same cooldown, but an increased duration of 25 seconds. Instead of plus 20% damage, healing and crit chance, you will now have plus 3% damage and haste only. But every time you spend Holy Power, it will give you another 3% to each for every Holy Power spent. This stacks for up to 10 times for a total of plus 30% damage and haste. To get the best out of this ability, you should make sure you are able to spend Holy Power as soon as you activate Crusade. You want to build up the stacks as quickly as possible, but remember that Justicar's Vengeance is not a suitable way to do this. Crusade has a longer duration than Avenging Wrath, but retains the same cooldown. Inquisition takes the form of a buff to damage and haste, which costs Holy Power to build and maintain. Depending on how much Holy Power you have, it will consume all of it up to a maximum of 3 Holy Power. For each Holy Power spent, you will get 15 seconds of the buff. If you use Inquisition while the buff is already active, it will allow you to build the buff up to a maximum of 1 minute duration. There is no cooldown on Inquisition, so in theory you can use it whenever you want. However, if doing so would take the duration well over 1 minute, then it will not let you cast. In general, you should aim to refresh the buff with less than 15 seconds remaining and when you have at least 2 Holy Power built up. You should always aim to have over 20 seconds of Inquisition remaining before using Avenging Wrath, as you do not want to waste Holy Power on a buff during your major DPS cooldown. If you have less than 20 seconds, then refresh it first, then use Avenging Wrath. When it comes to the priority order of abilities, it looks very much like this. This action priority list has been worked out by the spec senior Theory Crafter Sol Sacra, using Simulation Craft, with big shouts to Max and Skeletor for building the modules and also finding and occasionally creating problems. Now, Inquisition at the top, ideally you don't want to refresh this during an important DPS window, so refresh if necessary before using Avenging Wrath, Crusade or Execution Sentence. Try and do this in advance rather than react when the time comes to use your cooldowns, otherwise you'll end up delaying those cooldowns longer than you'd like to. After that, Execution Sentence if you've taken it, then spend if on 5 Holy Power. If you've got a Divine Purpose proc and it's about to expire, then make sure you use that. Don't ever allow those procs to go to waste. Then Wake of Ashes. If you're on 0 Holy Power, this is the point at which it comes in here. If you're on 1 Holy Power and you can use Blade of Justice, then use Blade of Justice, get yourself your 3 Holy Powers, spend, then use Wake of Ashes. Alternatively, if you don't have Blade of Justice available, then sure, use Wake of Ashes on 1 Holy Power, it's not that bad. Then Blade of Justice, Judgment, Hammer of Wrath, Consecration if you've got it. Then Crusader Strike if you have 2 charges of it. After that, if you've got, say, 4 Holy Power, then spend, then Crusader Strike. Arcane Torrent, if you're a Blood Elf, is right at the bottom. It's on the global cooldown now. So if you don't need it for any utility purposes, it's bottom priority. But there are going to be times in your
rotation. When you have a bit of downtime, you can use it then. Now, opening the damage is a crucial part of any DPS's rotation, and it is no different for Ret Paladins. You will generally want to use your Avenging Wrath as soon as possible, if on a raid boss. This is because the serious raider pre-pots. This involves consuming a damage potion a second before you get into combat, so the cooldown begins, and you can then take a second potion later in the fight. In addition, you do most damage by lining up DPS cooldowns, so combining your DPS potion with Avenging Wrath is a must. However, if you take the Inquisition talent, then you will need to apply that buff first. You must ensure that Inquisition will last longer than Avenging Wrath, or you have to waste Holy Power on non-damage dealing. So you might elect to begin with Judgment and Blade of Justice, then Inquisition, and then use Avenging Wrath and into a cycle of building and spending Holy Power according to the standard action priority list. In battle for Azeroth, Strength should remain our most powerful stat. In terms of the secondary stats of Haste, Mastery, Crit and Versatility, there is no set priority order, as they are often close enough that the values depend on you personally. If you start to build up a lot of one stat, then the others will fall behind and become higher in value. However, you can generally consider Haste to be our most important secondary stat, usually followed by Crit. Please note that when judging the value of a piece of equipment, you should sim it and not just try and work it out using the stats. The easiest and most accurate way to do this is currently with raid bots, which I'll cover in the resources section. It is worth remembering that our mastery only buffs holy damage dealing abilities. That means how much mastery we have might determine our choice of talent. As an example, if you have lots of mastery, then Hammer of Wrath will deal more damage, but Blade of Justice will be unaffected. This means that Hammer of Wrath talent might be significantly stronger than Blade of Wrath. However, at low mastery levels, you might find that Hammer of Wrath isn't such a strong talent. As with judging gear, however, simulating your character is always the best way of judging talent choices if unsure. Now, of course, when it comes to race, people want to see how the different racials are going to do and look at a list like this and go, oh, must play Blood Elf. Now, that actually may be true. And then for Alliance, you look at it and you think, oh, Lightforged Draenei looks shiny, let's go for that. It's not always this simple. You have to bear in mind, I've seen slightly different results with different sims. It all sort of depends on the gear you're using, the talents you're using, the particular Azerite traits you're using. And if you do the calculation, the difference on these sims between the top and the bottom is 1%. And it's not even just a case of, oh, 1%'s not that much. But actually, if you're min-maxing, it can be. You've got to bear in mind, this is just one round of sims. It is a 5-minute patchwork sim, which doesn't cover all situations. It's in a particular set of gear. I got some 370 gear from the vendor in the beta, which includes a massive raid gear, which will be the sort of stuff we're going to be working towards, sure. And it's a particular set of talents. Now, the other thing to bear in mind is a number of racials that have good utility. For example, humans might look as if they're being knocked off their hill down at the bottom there, but in actual fact, do you know what? They get a rep boost. That's always useful at the start of an expansion. Do you know the other thing they get? They get something that can break stuns. That's always useful as well. Blood Elves, of course, also get Arcane Torrent, which is not just the Holy Power generator. It's on the global cooldown. Boo-hoo. They've lost the silence, but nonetheless, the ability they've got could still be useful, particularly in dungeons. So often it's a case of actually looking at the utility side of these, because bear in mind, the sims can vary depending on gear, like I say, depending on the situation, depending on talent, depending on length of fight, and it's so tight between them, it's really not worth basing your decision on these numbers. So in this section, I'm going to recommend some useful add-ons and macros. For more details on using the add-ons, check out my add-on playlist where I keep my detailed add-on guides. Whenever I feel the need to update them, and there's a few that I'm probably going to need to do round about now, I'll always ensure that it's only the most up-to-date guide that's in the actual playlist. So Hakili. Hakili is a rotation helper which provides a good overview of available abilities in a tidy space on your UI. The great benefit of Hakili over other rotation add-ons is not only is it the only one that I can be confident will be accurate, as it takes its APL directly from Simulation Craft, developed by the top theory crafters, but also that it shows you the next few abilities which will be coming available in the priority sequence. This helps you plan ahead instead of simply doing whack-a-mole. Clique. Now we have a number of helpful abilities which can be used on friendly players, such as Blessing of Protection, Blessing of Freedom, Cleanse Toxins, Lay on Hands, as well as debuffs for enemy targets such as Hammer of Justice and Hand of Hindrance. It is often a DPS lost, as well as costing more time to manually target and then use the ability, followed by retargeting the original enemy. It is much better to use a mouse over function. This involves simply placing your cursor over the intended target and using the ability without ever having to deselect our primary target. It allows us to carry on DPSing, with the only cost being the global cooldown. This can be done with a mouse over macro, but you only have so many macro slots available. However, the add-on Click allows you to use as many as you would like, and it only takes up 2 macro slots. Tell Me When and WeakAuras 2 are really useful for creating notifications and for tracking abilities. The default system of tracking buffs is not very convenient, as we are not interested in all of them. These add-ons allow you to track procs, cooldowns and other important notifications in a way that you can customize to your taste. I personally use Tell Me When for this, as it does everything I need and is easier to learn than WeakAuras. However, WeakAuras is better and it can do more things. So it's sort of up to you there. Now, when it comes to macros, there are a few that may be of use. A cancel aura for Divine Shield, for example. There are situations where we might need to use Divine Shield, but then remove it before the duration naturally ends. Mad, I know, but these things occasionally happen. So you can use a cancel aura macro to remove this or any other buff when it comes to it. Targeting BOP on a named player. So sometimes the tactics for a fight require a specific player to receive your Blessing of Protection at a given point during the fight. You could just use your normal Blessing of Protection bind to place it on them, but if it's planned, then I find it better to have a specific macro. That way, I don't have to move my cursor over the raid frames, and I don't risk accidentally placing it on the wrong player if I have a situation of my own in the fight to distract me. A focus macro for Hammer of Justice, or an interrupt for a named mob. You can also make a macro with the named mob if you like, so either of these macros are fine. If you're going to use the focus macro, then you need to make sure that that mob is your focus, and that'll keep resetting every time the encounter resets, so you always have to remember to do that. But if it's always going to be for a named mob, then you can set up a specific one as well. Now, using Avenging Wrath or Crusade with an on-use trinket is really useful, especially now that Blizzard have said that on-use trinkets will not be on the global cooldown. Remember what we said about being able to combine your DPS cooldowns. And if you have an on-use trinket with a 2-minute cooldown, well, win-win. We just have to make sure that for this macro, you put the trinket in the number 13 slot, which is the first of them. Just to check you've got it right, always test macros before you take it into the field to make sure it works. Now, if you don't want to just use the /use 13, you can put the specific name of the trinket in as well, that works. But if you have multiple on-use trinkets, this one is just always going to work. And finally, if you like switching between using Consecration and Wake of Ashes, then a macro like this stops you needing to mess about with your action bar every time you change your talents. In terms of additional resources, your best bet is to join the Paladin Discord community. The name is Hammer of Wrath, and you can find the most senior theory crafters and many of the best performing Ret Paladins rubbing shoulders with the masses there. It's a great place to get some help, but do make sure that you've read everything in the FAQ channel as well as the pins in the relevant channel as well. People there are not likely to be impressed with a commonly asked question which has been answered in those places. Imagine this, you go onto there for the very first time, you ask what you think is a perfectly sensible question, and then a load of people are rolling their eyes, you're wondering what's going on here. It's because everyone is asking that question every 10 minutes. It gets a little bit wearing. And whenever people do ask questions every 10 minutes, it tends to be put in the FAQ. Of course, I also provide more than simply this essentials guide. It will be my intention to keep producing guides on further niche areas, such as, say, opening the DPS in weird situations, Azeroth traits, talents to use in dungeons and raids, general advice in dungeons and raids for normal and heroic, as well as general Ret Paladin discussions, just as I've done in the past. There are regular Ret Paladin videos on my channel, so make sure you subscribe and keep an eye on the Ret Paladin guide and discussion playlist for anything of interest. Now, an important skill, and I've talked about this before, for the serious Retribution Paladin is to be able to sim yourself. Fortunately, a very nice chap at Raidbots has you covered. This is a website that will allow you to sim your character and determine which talents, Azeroth traits or even equipment you should be using. It's super simple to use, and it's also accurate because it takes its information from Simulation Craft, which is not always that simple to use for a lot of people. But Raidbots is super easy. There are perks to becoming a paying customer, but all of the services are free if you don't mind a queue for the simulation to work. The queue is often shorter if you do it at off-peak times. I'll also be providing a video guide on using Raidbots once it has been fully updated for Battle for Azeroth in the add-ons playlist, So if you're watching this significant time after Battle for Azeroth was launched, then it's likely to already be there. Now, many players just want a simple answer to gear or talenting, which takes the form of what's the best gear or what's the best talent. But it really is personal to you. If you're just going to go with an easy but very wrong answer to those questions, then you might as well just take the gear with the highest item level and the talents down the left-hand side of the talent tree. If you actually want to do better, then you must understand your character. It's not a difficult skill, however, so don't be put off. Warcraft logs are also a great way to analyse your performance and compare yourself, and you should really get used to using this resource if you want to become a serious player. If you're more interested in casual play, then it's not that important. Finally, it is worth noting that there are other considerations for Retribution Paladins, not least of which are gearing options. However, these are transient, and so I'll be producing detailed companion guides on Azerite options, general gearing, and so on, during the normal course of my channel. To stay informed of these, make sure you subscribe, click the bell notification, and preferably also follow me on either Twitter or Facebook for updates. YouTube are sometimes funny bunnies, and I've had subscribers occasionally tell me that they're not really getting the notifications. If you follow me on Twitter or Facebook, then I always link important videos that have been brought out there as well. You can also easily browse the Ret Paladin guide playlist on the front page of the channel for any videos you may have missed. I hope you found this guide useful and that it helps you improve as a Retribution Paladin as it has for thousands of others. If you've enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe and share with others who may also find it be useful. And until next time, I'll see you later and have fun in BFA.